Hey guys, it's Skybird, and following up my custom torso body, and also following up the CCBS criticism video, I guess, I wanted to go ahead and talk about the piece that you see on screen here, because this, in a nutshell, I think is a pretty interesting piece, and so I went ahead, hopped on over into Blender, and made my own version, this piece right here. Now, you will see right off the bat, it's got some interesting things going on. For one thing, it has two different pin connections facing in perpendicular connections, meaning that they go across each other rather than facing parallel with each other, right? And this actually allows for a lot, because it allows for this singular piece to actually be able to accommodate nearly every single piece of armor that LEGO has ever made. In some cases, it's not going to work without specific interfaces, let's say, but for all intents and purposes, this is going to work nearly 100% of the time. Let's go ahead and show you what I mean by that. So you can see over here that I have connected or combined this piece with all of these different types of armor, including feet pieces colored here in green, weapon pieces colored in orange. We've got another one over here as well. Specific armor pieces colored in medium blue, as well as chest armor colored in dark azure, since it's fairly close. And then as well, we've even got the stars armor here. Now, the stars armor is obviously an exception because that connects with an axle rather than a pin. But the thing is, I'm not actually positive this piece needs to have pin connections or axle connections, because I think there are some scenarios where axle connections actually work better. However, certain pieces are not possible with an axle connection, like this one here, which has to actually be bent at an angle to allow for it to connect properly, thanks to the fact that it has these little tines that come off the end, these little fork edges that come off the end here, right? So if I went to try and rotate this, it's going to collide with the piece itself. It cannot happen. However, at the same time, adding only axles would also limit specific piece connections, like this one here, right? Because this piece is connecting via a half pin rather than a full-size pin. And so because of that, it's going to limit it in that scenario as well. However, with those two exceptions, everything else can connect if you have the axle-based version rather than the version that connects via pinholes on the side. Does that make sense? So, if we ignore these special cases right here, and let's go ahead and throw the Visorak foot and the Bittel or Gorast weapon out here as well, we still get all of this armor that is fully compatible with this long socket. And technically, these two are still possible, so you either trade out these two for the stars armor, or you keep these two and get rid of the stars armor connection, if that makes sense. Now, it is still possible to connect stars armor to these. You just need to interface more pieces. Obviously, for one thing, you can connect the stars armor via the front, because there is an axle hole on the front in both cases, and I think that that works just fine, but it's not strictly necessary. Of course, ignoring that, because every piece has a little bit of troubleshooting, right? No piece is a one-size-fits-all solution. I still think that this is a very compatible piece, because you'll also notice there's a ball joint in the center. And as we all know, if we take a look at CCBS shells, which should be over here in the large figure parts, those will actually be able to connect to this as well. And I meant to go to Hero Factory parts instead. So yeah, pieces like these are going to be able to connect both to the front of this piece as well as to the side of this piece. Now, it still has the, I want to say, 90-degree limiter on it, because I don't know what else to call that. Although I think it could be interesting to make like an 8-sided version, so that instead of having to connect it at 90 degrees, maybe you could also do stuff like this where it connects at a corner angle, whatever the case may be. But for simplicity's sake, for kids' sake, obviously keeping up the 90-degree connectivity is more than enough in most cases, right? So I think overall, this is a fairly useful piece. Is it going to replace the long socket in every scenario? No, absolutely not. There are certain scenarios where the long socket performs better or uses less pieces. It's notable, for example, that in this version back here, we basically cannot connect this the normal way, because there's nothing nothing to connect it to. That ball joint in the center does not have a connection on it. So because of that, we have to interface this with extra pieces, which does beef up the parts count there by some, right? And there are also scenarios where it's going to be a little awkward to connect things like this Kina armor here, which basically cannot connect to this piece, again, unless it has that axle connection on the side. So if we go ahead and take this out for a moment, and even with that, you could see we're still running into problems with collision, right? Because this is going to collide with the ball at the bottom, and if we flip it around, it's going to collide with the socket at the top, right? So realistically, this piece cannot connect with this, again, without interfacing several other pieces, right? So I think overall, it's an interesting piece. It's not as compatible, overly compatible as like the torso that I just designed. But I think this still ends up working overall because remember, if LEGO had designed this piece themselves, especially if they had designed it earlier in Bionicle's run, say 2005, 2006, somewhere in there, then they would have designed these types of pieces around that, right? So as an example of that, because LEGO has the ability to change their designs around, maybe we wouldn't have seen the pin connection here in the center, but maybe it would have been directly below that. And if we flip it around the back side, maybe this little gap here, which is kind of hard to see in this color, but there's a little bit of a gap, a little bit of a notch in this piece specifically, that could have been widened out a little bit to accept a ball socket or a ball joint. Not necessarily to connect to it, but to make room for it. Does that make sense? Now, if LEGO had come up with the concept of CCBS sooner, then I think they could have definitely utilized it to a fuller potential, let's say. But again, it's all limiting in certain scenarios. So we just have to kind of keep our guard up, if you will, and get creative with the parts and pieces that are available, because Bionicle is, at its core, a love letter from LEGO, honestly. And it's one of the main reasons why I criticize CCBS, is because CCBS sort of exists as its own fundamentally separate system. Yes, it interfaces in some scenarios with Technic or with Bionicle, but oftentimes you have to go out of your way to do that. Now, when it comes to using like Bionicle limbs with CCBS, that's fairly easy. But as you start to attach different kinds of armors, you end up having to actually work harder with certain types of builds, or it restricts you depending on the type of build that you're trying to make. So CCBS, love it or hate it, it definitely has its uses, and I think it's definitely a toy line, especially for younger kids that want to get into building action figures, that want something, you know, more, I don't want to say intuitive, more involved, let's say, than like going to the store and buying a G.I. Joe, buying a Barbie, buying whatever toy suits you as a kid. But in this scenario, you get something that you get to make from the ground up and that you get to sort of put your own story behind. That's one of the beautiful things about Bionicle, about Hero Factory, is that it's all up to you who these characters are, what you create, and this is just a piece to help facilitate that creation. So anyway, that's it for this one, guys. Again, thank you all so much for the recent support on the channel. Really, really love to see that. And as always, if you want to subscribe, you're more than welcome to. It helps to show that you value, I guess, the content that I'm making here. And let me know your thoughts in the comments. How would you address a piece like this? Would you make two versions, a version with pins and axles, or would you just stick to one or the other, and why? And also, I'm going to go ahead and throw this one onto the Discord as well in the mock instructions channel, so you will be able to download it and play with it yourself too. So yeah, if you want to kind of mess around with it, see what you can create with it, I would welcome that. All right, I'll see you on the next one. Take care.